It was 1931 and war was spreading first across Asia. Imperialistic Japan, although relying on other nations for natural resources such as oil, organized a plan to invade China. They started by seizing Manchuria in 1931. This was a radical violation to the League of Nations. Once Japan was reprimanded by the League, Japan withdrew from the organization. In 1937, a full invasion of China was in action. Japanese soldiers entered Nanking, the capital of China, murdering 300,000 civilian men, women, and children, and destroying the city. Within a year, Japan controlled all but China's western interior and threatened all of Asia and the Pacific.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific.
On December 7th, 1941, the day that will live in infamy, the Japanese military launched a surprise attack against the American naval base Pearl Harbor. The attack was intended to impair the United States fleet and pave the way for a full-scale Japanese invasion of the Pacific. 353 fighter, bomber, and torpedo planes, accompanied by 6 aircraft carriers, devastated United States forces in Hawaii. 4 U.S. carriers were sunk, 4 others were damaged, 3 cruisers and destroyers were sunk, and to make matters worse, the Japanese forces destroyed 188 United States aircraft, killed 2,402 Americans, and wounded another 1,250. The attack led to the involvement of the United States of America in World War II, as the following day, December 8th, the United States declared war on Japan, and 3 days later, December 11th, the United States was at war with Germany and Italy.
After Pearl Harbor, the United States declared war on Japan. A few days after Pearl Harbor, Germany declared war on the United States. The U.S. began mobilizing for war. Congress passed the War Powers Act, which gave Roosevelt executive powers during war. These new powers created agencies such as the SPAB, OPA, NWLB, WMC, OWM, and OMI to help the war effort.
Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States Executive Order 9066 was signed and issued during World War II by United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt on February 19, 1942, authorizing the Secretary of War to prescribe certain areas as military zones. Eventually, Executive Order 9066 cleared the way for the relocation of Japanese Americans to internment camps. Any person in the continental United States with at least one Japanese grandparent was given 2 weeks to close shops, settle personal issues, after which they would be taken to a nearby internment camp. Japanese citizens were brought to these internment camps because of an overarching suspicion that they might hold loyalties to Japan and act out against the United States.
May 7th and 8th, 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea. This battle was fought in the waters southwest of the Solomon Islands and eastward from New Guinea, an operational and strategic defeat for the Japanese. This battle was the first major counter to the great offensive the Japanese had begun 5 months earlier. They had intended to establish a new air base, enhance the defense of Japan's newly enlarged oceanic empire, and threaten Australian defenses. The Japanese forces planned a surprise attack, but due to superior intelligence, the United States was able to respond with forces of its own. Due to the heroic actions of the United States, the Japanese were forced to call off their invasion. Despite losses on both sides, the Battle of the Coral Sea was a major turning point in the war in the Pacific.
On June 1st, 1941, 1 month after the Battle of Coral Sea, the Japanese fleet converged on Midway Island, an atoll proven to be a strategically vital location for communications and defense of Hawaii. Americans knew that there was a Japanese fleet planning to attack. However, all thanks to code-breaking specialists, the Americans knew when and where the Japanese fleet planned their attack. During the battle, when the fleet was encountered, American planes sank 4 vital Japanese aircraft carriers filled with Japan's best air pilots and destroyed hundreds of planes. This ended Japan's threat to Hawaii and the U.S. West Coast.
The date is February 19th, 1945. The U.S. engaged the Empire of Japan in the first battle on the Japanese home islands in the Battle of Iwo Jima, or also known as Operation Detachment. The United States assaulted and captured the airfields on Iwo Jima in some of the fiercest fighting in the Pacific Campaign of World War II. Both sides had their advantages in this battle. The Japanese forces were heavily entrenched with a system of bunkers, artillery, and underground tunnels. The Americans, however, had extensive naval and air support, capable of an overwhelming amount of firepower. About 7,000 Americans were killed during this battle, while the entire Japanese force of 22,000 men were either captured or killed. This decisive American victory led to the end of the invasion of Iwo Jima on March 26th and was immortalized by Joe Rosenthal's photograph of the raising of the United States flag.
Island hopping was a strategy used by the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps which pushed to capture a series of important atolls inhabited by well-armed Japanese defenders. Conquering these islands would create an open path to Japan. In November 1943, Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands was the first of these islands in island hopping assaults. Guam, Saipan, and Tinian were other islands assaulted. The Battle of the Philippines was another decisive naval engagement fought in June 1944, and the Japanese fleet suffered a crippling loss.
5 days later, the invasion of Okinawa began. Easter Sunday, April 1st, 1945. The battle was the largest amphibious operation mounted by the Americans in the Pacific Theater. After a long campaign of island hopping, the Allies were approaching Japan and needed Okinawa. The island held great strategic importance. It was located only 350 miles southwest of the home islands of Japan and had vital air bases that could be used in the invasion of Japan. But the struggle proved to be a massacre. More Americans died or were wounded in the invasion of Okinawa than at Normandy. One reason for the immense death toll in this battle was the Japanese kamikaze. Known as Divine Wind, the kamikaze fighters were pilots who flew suicide missions in planes with a 500-pound bomb and only enough fuel for a one-way flight. The Allied forces lost about 45,500 men from combat and disease. However, these numbers paled in comparison to 100,000 Japanese soldiers killed and between 50,000 to 150,000 civilians killed in the fight. 90% of the buildings on the island were completely destroyed, and the lush tropical landscape was turned into a vast field of mud, lead, decay, and maggots. But the taking of Okinawa was invaluable to the Allied cause.
From July 17th to August 2nd, 1945, Harry Truman met with the other world powers about the issue of Japan. Truman secured Stalin's promise to be in war against Japan by August 15th. Meanwhile, America begins testing atomic bombs in New Mexico and off the coast of the Pacific. America was convinced the Soviet Union's assistance was not needed to bring the war to a close, however. August 3rd, 1945, Japan wires its refusal to surrender to America. 3 days later, the city of Hiroshima was hit with an atomic bomb that killed over 40,000 people upon impact, and over 200,000 people by 1950. The city of Nagasaki was also atomically bombed on August 14th, killing another 70,000 people. In this act, the United States of America got Japan to surrender and ended the war in the Pacific. In addition, the most unfathomable act of nuking Japan succeeded in intimidating the Soviet Union.